meeting, but welcome to this session on masculinities, crime, and justice. We have three speakers today. I will introduce each one of them when I invite them to talk. Since we have three speakers, each of them will have 15 minutes, and we want to guarantee that we have time for debate. We're planning having around 40 minutes for the debate. Well, this session on masculinities, crime, and justice is a really important one in this last day, and I think we will sum up some of the ideas that we've been discussing for the last 3 days. We already know that men represent more than 80% of homicides, more than 90% of those who carry out homicides, and more than 90% of the global population of those in prison. That's the visible data that we know. Research has looked at the way that certain forms of masculinity are connected to men's participation in forms of violence and delinquency, and the way that masculinity intersects with social exclusion and institutionalized racism in understanding men's participation in criminality, delinquency, and multiple forms of violence. In this session, we will explore the drivers of men's use of violence in general, and in particular, the implication of research in terms of answers, programming, policy making, etc. So I invite Rachel Jukes. Rachel, I think you all know her. Rachel is the acting vice president of the South African Medical Research Council. She's the director of the MRC's Gender and Health Research Unit. She's a medical doctor and public health specialist. And she's been working on gender health in South Africa for the last 20 years. So thank you, Rachel. You have 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Good. I'm glad to see the presentations up there. So I'm going to talk about sexual violence, and predominantly about sexual violence against women. And to start this, I want to remind you that sexual violence, in fact, most commonly occurs within the intimate partner violence space, either on its own or accompanied by physical or emotional abuse by an intimate partner. But we also talk about non-partner sexual abuse, usually, or sexual violence, usually rape, and sexual abuse in childhood, which by definition, unless it's committed by a dating partner, or I guess a husband if it's a child marriage, is committed by a non-partner. There are many other forms of violence against women which involve sexual violence, but I'm not going to refer to those in this presentation. I'm predominantly going to talk about intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual violence. The prevalence of non-partner sexual violence has recently been studied through a systematic review that looked at 412 estimates across 56 countries. And this review found that 7.2% of women worldwide had ever experienced non-partner sexual violence. And if we think about this as really meaning that something between 1 in 20 and 1 in 15 women have ever experienced non-partner sexual violence, and the definition of this used was rape, it really puts in perspective how common this act is and provides a very different lens on non-partner rape from that which is communicated in the media, which most often suggests that this is an isolated occurrence rather than something which actually happens in communities around the world on a daily basis as part of the systematic violation of women. We see quite large global variation in estimates. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly high, 21% in this series, or 17% for southern Sub-Saharan Africa, which you'll note is an area that is not in war, largely. And in South Asia, the prevalence was 3%. All of these figures from women's perspectives on rape are incredibly important, but I want to put to you that our central task in terms of prevention of rape is to change the act of perpetration of rape. And in order to do this, we need to understand rape perpetration. Now, this is an area which has been studied quite a lot internationally in populations of incarcerated rapists. But these are populations that don't necessarily tell us very much about rape in the general population. Because in every country in the world, the vast majority of men who commit rape never face any form of legal or police sanction whatsoever, and certainly never end up in jail. I mean, in South Africa, of those cases reported to the police, it is 7 out of every 100 that result in the perpetrator going to jail. And in fact, we think that at least there are at least 8 other cases, if not more, for every 1 case that's reported to the police. So a very small proportion of men who perpetrate rape ever go to jail. So the question is, can we study rape amongst adult men in the general population? Well, we looked at this in South Africa and in fact conducted the first large population-based study. And in a large population, we interviewed about 1,700 men across an area of 3 districts of South Africa. And what we discovered was that 28% of the men disclosed having ever perpetrated rape. And 21% of all the men said that they'd raped a woman non-partner. And these figures were really shocking because essentially this takes rape completely out of the domain of being an act of the, antisocial, abnormal fringe of masculinity into it becoming essentially a male norm, 1 in 4 men having perpetrated. This work also inspired us to take part in the UN multi-country study on men and violence in Asia and the Pacific. And this study was undertaken by Partners for Prevention, and we were involved in providing technical assistance from South Africa. And the study conducted research in 9 sites across 6 countries of Asia and the Pacific. These were Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, China, Sri Lanka, and Bougainville Island in Papua New Guinea. And we used standardized methods, and we used iPod touch technology so that the questions on rape were self-administered to men. And this is the technology we'd also used in South Africa, which enables men to confess to this practice which is devastating for women, but without having to actually speak it into verbally and tell a field worker. And that's a very important component for research on rape, because it's very important, firstly, that our staff don't have to deal with the knowledge that the person they're talking to has committed this violation against women. But it's also very important that because rape is illegal, you have to do it in a confidential manner, because you can't have a situation in research where a quarter of the people you're interviewing, you then have to go and report to the police. So this methodology was incredibly important, and overall the Partners for Prevention study resulted in interviews with 10,178 men and 3,000 women across the sites, and we got very high response rates. These were the perpetration prevalence figures, and what you see is that most countries we saw over 5%, under 10% of men reporting perpetration of rape against a non-partner. The only exception is Bangladesh. But if we think again of 5%, that means 1 in 20 men have raped a non-partner. It really provides an important new perspective on thinking about non-partner rape. Jayapura in Indonesia and Bougainville in Papua New Guinea were much higher. And as you see by the red part of the bar, in fact, gang rape is much more common than people think it is. We also asked about rape of men and found again that where rape of women was particularly common in Bougainville, rape of men was particularly common. And we're seeing nearly 1 in 10 men reporting having experienced rape themselves. In most other countries, it was below 2%, which is roughly 1 in 50 men. We often think about conflict as being a context for rape, and of course it is a context of rape. But just as Laurie Heiser said that intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence against women in conflict, in fact, we asked men in Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, which is an island which had been racked by a civil war for 10 years, about rape in conflict. We found that amongst those men who reported ever raping, only a proportion, it's about 15% of those who'd ever raped in conflict. And in fact, amongst all of the men, which is what you see in this pie chart, only 7% raped in conflict, whereas 54% had committed a rape in a non-conflict context. So we need to put rape in conflict. It's a very serious problem, but we need to look at it in perspective when compared to the problem of rape outside conflict settings, which is a very much bigger problem. So the question is, what's driving rape? And I don't expect any of you to be able to read this, and some of you may not be able to statistically understand this. But what I've put up here is a table which showed an analysis of what really distinguished men who committed single perpetrator rape compared to those who hadn't raped. That's this column. And what distinguished men who'd committed multiple perpetrator rape compared to those who hadn't raped, which is the far column. And I think the most important thing to look here is the groups of characteristics that were associated. So these characteristics were more common amongst men who raped than amongst other men. The first group are what I call social characteristics, not having been to high school, having food insecurity, and having, well, one of them was having ever been married, which was more common for single perpetrator rapists. But with not having been at high school and having food insecurity, what we're looking at really are indicators of social marginalisation. The second group are indicators of victimisation history, having been physically, sexually or emotionally abused or neglected in childhood, and having experienced violence. And we've talked a lot about the vulnerability of men over the last few days. And these indicators are clearly indicators of men's victimisation and vulnerability. These enduring neuropsychological impact played out through lower self-esteem, lower capacity to feel guilt, empathy, and insecurity. Next group of psychological factors of alcohol problems and empathy. And again, this may have a direct impact on risk of raping, but it may also be that, for example, alcohol problems reflect a frustration with the masculine position. The following group are a group of factors related to relationships with women, being more likely to be physically violent towards women, having more sexual partners, and having had sex with a sex worker. And these reflect underlying ideas of masculinity, really linked to the idea that men should be in control and dominant over women, and should be engaged in conspicuous displays of heterosexuality. And then the final group are what I call antisocial and violent behaviours of other types, men having fought weapons, being involved with gangs, or having used drugs in the last year, and particularly prominently associated with multiple perpetrator rape, and indicate a sort of tough masculinity rooted in a culture ready to use violence, as well as a propensity for illegal and antisocial behaviour. We also asked men what was the reason for the last rape that they committed against a non-partner. And this was really shed enormous light on our understanding of the problem of rape. Because what we see here is that most men endorsed statements that related to sexual entitlement. Essentially, most men rape because they want to. The second group was entertainment, because they're bored, because they want to have fun, because they want a woman and they think they can go out and get her. These are the sexual entitlement and entertainment questions that men endorsed. Essentially, rape is seen as a game. Anger and punishment was also a factor, and we see rape after drinking as being much, much less part of the overall context in which rape occurred. So how do we make meaning from these risk factors? Well, essentially, I think we have two groups of factors. We have those that are rooted in social marginalisation and vulnerability and stem an impact on men's own experience of victimisation and abuse. And those are rooted in ideals of masculinity, hegemonic masculinity predicated on a patriarchal dominance and control over women, valorising publicly performed heterosexuality, and a willingness to engage in risk-taking and excess. And we also see a hypermasculinity, which is all of the above, but in an accentuated form, and includes engagement with criminal and antisocial behaviour. It's not always easy to see the boundary between these two forms of masculinity. And we need to remember, of course, that rape is a criminal act in most countries, but it's not always associated with, sorry, I've written hypersexuality, I mean hypermasculinity. And so a sort of accentuated violent masculinity is not the only masculinity associated with rape. One of the key questions we've been discussing over the last few days has been the relationship between men's own experience of victimisation and poverty and engagement in acts of violence against women. And we wanted to look at this in some of our data on rape. In fact, what I'm showing you here, and I'll explain it, is actually from South Africa. Because I think it's incredibly important that we understand what is and what isn't the role of men's victimisation. And basically what I've put up here is a structural equation model that was looking at pathways to rape perpetration, with the starting point being socio-economic status. What we see in this model is that actually men have essentially, at the end of the day, a common pathway to rape perpetration, which is through a kind of expression of masculinity in terms of controlling women. There's high indicators of emphasized heterosexuality and engagement in antisocial behavior. And so I've put that there and I've labeled it hegemonic masculinity, and that is a common pathway. But in fact, there are two routes to the pathway. One route is for poorer men, and men who are poorer are much more vulnerable to being exposed to childhood trauma of all types. And this is not just men being sexually abused going on to sexually abuse women. It's very important to remember that emotional abuse and neglect and physical violence against men are also part of it. And so what we see here is poor men are more likely to be victimised in childhood, and as a response to that, more likely to engage in practices which they see as striving to live up to this sort of hegemonic ideal. And we also see a pathway through wealth, so that richer men are also more likely to rape because of rape stemming from sexual entitlement, and being wealthier are more likely to engage in many of the practices of hegemonic masculinity and raping. And I know there's been quite a lot of discussion about whether you can really call poor men hegemonic because of their lack of access to power at a societal level. But I think it's important to remember that hegemonic masculinity is a cultural model of how to be a man. And even though men may not be able to live up to every aspect of that cultural model, for example, they may not be able to be a provider, they may be able to engage in conspicuous heterosexuality by having lots of partners, or trying to emphasize their sexual attractiveness towards women, their sex drive, or emphasize their toughness and strength amongst men. So hegemonic masculinity still has currency amongst poor men and is associated in the pathway to rape. And it's also worth remembering that most women poor men rape are poor women. So just to finish, I think that recognizing the structural dimensions of rape points to us to identify high-risk groups for intervention. And men who live in poverty and have the most pronounced deprivation are clearly a high-risk group for intervention around rape prevention. And privileged men with power, with an exaggerated sense of entitlement, are also a high-risk group. Interventions with men on rape need to acknowledge the victimization and vulnerability of some men. But it's very important not to assume that all rapists are victims and that all men who've been sexually violated will end up being, or victimized in other ways, will end up raping. Rape, of course, is very profoundly rooted in hegemonic masculinity, and gender transformation is incredibly important for rape prevention. I think it's also important to remember that empowering women to prevent rape is a key aspect of interventions, and very interesting new findings about the value of both ideological empowerment, giving women the right to take action when threatened by men, and say no to men, is incredibly important. And work we do in South Africa shows that actually surprisingly few women who are raped by non-partners actually do fight back and do run away. And I think it's very important that we look at this at an ideological level as well as at a practical level. And we also need to look at other areas like self-defense training for women, because there is evidence from research being conducted in slums in Kenya that women can quite substantially reduce their risk of sexual violence with self-defense training. And I think this really reminds us that we do need to work with women to prevent rape, and it's not just about working with men. Of course, women don't cause rape, but individual women can learn to do things to reduce their individual chance of being raped, and that is incredibly important to them, even if it is the case that the man may then go off and rape somebody else. So I want to thank you very much. I've run out of time. The UN multi-country study was developed by Partners for Prevention, which encompassed the UNDP, UNFPA and UN Women, and was a regional joint program based from Thailand. And this presentation is part of the What Works to Prevent Violence program of action. Thank you.
I now invite our next speaker, Álvaro Campos, from the University of Costa Rica and also the director of the Costa Rican Institute of Masculinity and Sexuality.
Good morning. My name is Álvaro Campos. I am a clinical psychologist and sexologist. I work at the University of Costa Rica. 14 years ago, I worked at the Costa Rican Institute of Masculinity and Sexuality, known as Instituto UEM. Treatment program for men with problems of power, control, and violence, integrating body and emotional awareness with thoughts and behaviors. UEM's experience. Costa Rica is a small country in Central America. Its area is 50,000 square kilometers. There are 5 million people only. What's UEM means? Means men in a native language. Costa Rican context. Costa Rica is a middle-income country. It has high levels of education. There are many laws that protect the rights of women and punish violence against women. If a man commits domestic violence and he is reported, he receives legal measures as punishment. If the man violates these measures, he goes to jail. The government has a national policy of gender equality, but gender is understood basically as women issues. There is a women movement organized and strong. There is a public policy of preventing violence. However, there is no masculinity public policy. Paradoxically, there is a national men's health law since October last year. Nevertheless, the issue of masculinity in recent years has begun to be a topic in training for national public institutions. What is WEN? WEN is an NGO that works with boys and men issues such as gender equality, violence prevention, positive masculinities, affective fatherhood, health, culture of peace, human rights, sexualities, diversity, prevention of risk, sexual violence, health, sexual. WEN Institute program. We have a program with ordinary men, common men, and a program with male perpetrators of violence. In this presentation, we will share the violence and culture of peace. This program has three main axes. One axis, crisis intervention and individual psychotherapy by phone or in person. The two, group psychotherapy and re-education of masculinity. And the third, male participation in violence prevention activities